Gun violence, more than anything, is a measure of injustice that a community faces. It is no coincidence that the communities that are most affected by gun violence are the ones with the least resources. One of the biggest predictors of where gun violence occurs in this country is where communities were redlined in the 1930s and 40s through discriminatory housing policy and white supremacist policies. Those scars of injustice result in gun violence to this day. And there is no way of talking about addressing gun violence, whether that is in the form of addressing the hatred that drove the 19-year-old at my high school to pick up a gun and use it against my classmates after being a self-declared Nazi and anti-Semite, or the systemic hatred that has driven policies historically like redlining and other discriminatory policies that then result in people feeling the need to pick up a gun in the first place.
Good evening, everybody. Everybody ready for a great discussion and a great panel? I am super excited to be with this distinguished group. I'll be moderating. I first want to say thank you to Alex for the very kind and generous introduction, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club for hosting this important conversation. I'm looking forward to it with all of you. And you don't need me to tell you we're at a moment when the stakes couldn't be higher. Gun violence has taken so much. We all unfortunately know the tragedy and the tragic stories, but yet again, survivors, families, advocates have turned pain into purpose and grief into action and found hope in each other and taking steps forward. And across the country, years of hard-fought progress are being dismantled in real time by President Trump, by the Trump administration. We're seeing recently $811 million in critical federal violence prevention funding wiped out overnight with a stroke of a pen. And that includes $2 million from one of our panelists, Dr. Griffin's organization, Youth Alive. And we'll hear about the impact that has had, an organization which helps survivors heal and avoid cycles of retaliation. Innovative and impactful and transformational in so many ways. And we need to be clear about what's happening, what the stakes are. The Trump administration is threatening public safety and endangering communities across the country. As bleak as Washington looks, we know the power of organized communities, of data-driven policy and evidence-based policy, and of relentless advocacy to change the trajectory. And we've seen what happens when those investments are protected. Here in California, we lead the way. If the national gun death rate matched ours over the last decade, nearly 140,000 Americans would still be with us today. And hundreds of thousands more injuries could have been prevented. California is a blueprint and an inspiration for how to tackle and confront gun violence. And 30 years ago, we had one of the highest firearm mortality rates in the nation. 30 years later, fast forward, we have one of the lowest firearm mortality rates in the nation because of common sense gun laws. It's not incidental, it's not accidental, it's not happenstance. It is cause and effect. Data-based common sense, gun laws save lives. And more states can do it, and the federal government can do it as well. And tonight we'll talk about how we move forward in these challenging circumstances, not just despite the political challenges, but because of them. We need to rise to the occasion, meet the moment, and do everything in our power to save more Americans from avoidable, preventable gun violence. And so I look forward to this discussion and hearing from our incredible experts. And let's begin with the question for the full panel. Gun violence intersects with so many major crises: domestic violence, community trauma, hate, political extremism, and more. What do you think most people still misunderstand about the reality of gun violence in this country, and what do you wish they understood better? Let's start with Chris.
Well, thank you so much for including me in this panel, and obviously a distinguished group that we have here, and thank you so much to all of you for coming out. The issue of gun violence prevention, I think one of the top things that I wish folks really internalized and understood, and I think you already have gone a bit there if you're here, is that it's preventable. It is 100% preventable. And when we think about gun violence in this country, it's not monolithic. There are different kinds of gun violence claiming lives across this country. So if we look at over the 40,000 deaths that happen as a result of gun violence, About 2/3 of those are suicide. We have 8 kids a day that are killed or injured with guns in their home. We've had homicides actually decline record lows, including in Washington, D.C., I might add, which has a 30-year low in homicides, but it still represents around 20+% of gun deaths. And then we have mass shootings. Horrible. We have mass shooting survivor here. We have mass shootings across this country that are happening every day that don't get reported. But ultimately, when we think about the solutions, what it often boils down to is the combination of policy and enforcement and locking up the gun in the home. And I just wish that more Americans across this country understood that what we hear on the news about gun violence is not actually what gun violence in America is really all about. And once we understand that a little better, the solutions and having California really lead the way in this has been huge because they work. You can't go from having a state with the highest per capita gun death and injury to the lowest if more laws, better enforcement, and locking up guns didn't work.
Thanks, Chris. And let's continue down the line here. We'll go with David.
I would say it's 2 things. One, it is that gun violence, more than anything, is a measure of injustice that a community faces. It is no coincidence that the communities that are most affected by gun violence are the ones with the least resources. One of the biggest predictors of where gun violence occurs in this country is where communities were redlined in the 1930s and 40s through discriminatory housing policy and white supremacist policies. Those scars of injustice result in gun violence to this day. And there is no way of talking about addressing gun violence, whether that is in the form of addressing the hatred that drove the 19-year-old at my high school to pick up a gun and use it against my classmates after being a self-declared Nazi, an anti-Semite, or the systemic hatred that has driven policies historically like redlining and other discriminatory policies that then result in people feeling the need to pick up a gun in the first place. It's no coincidence in this country that the communities with the most gun violence by far, oftentimes, if you look at a community like Parkland, the reason why we don't have shootings on a daily basis is not because we necessarily just have the strongest gun laws in the country. We did change some of those after Parkland, and that's great, and we need to. We've got to do work on that. But it's because the average median household income in Parkland is well over $150,000 a year. Nothing stops somebody from wanting to kill somebody else like resources in the first place. And the second thing that I would want to say is that in spite of all that you're seeing on the news, in spite of the mass shootings that we continue to see and the daily gun violence and the gun suicide, we are making progress on this. And that is a very hard thing to say, even as when I live in DC now, there have been 3 different shootings in the past year and a half that have happened within a block or 2 of my house. Just a few months ago, I literally was about to go to bed and I heard about, I think it was 6 or more gunshots down the street. And I walked down the street and there was a drive-by shooting that happened. So yes, gun violence is down in DC, but it's hard for people to feel like it actually is down because you're not going to hear about the shooting that doesn't happen. But we know, for example, after Parkland, when we did change gun laws in collaboration with the veterans of the gun safety movement, with our parents, with our teachers, and an intergenerational coalition that included students at the forefront, we passed the red flag law in a Republican trifecta state where so many people said it would not be possible. That since has been used over 20,000 times to disarm people that are risk themselves and others. And the last thing that I'll say is that I think the biggest obstacle to us addressing this issue and basically any other one in this country is not whether or not it is actually possible, it is whether or not we choose to do something about it and we believe that it could be possible in the first place. And that's what, if there's nothing else that you leave here today from what I say, it's that do not fall into the trap and the self-fulfilling prophecy of cynicism and negativity that tells us that the best that this country has to offer is behind us and not ahead of us, because a better day will come. And one day, school shootings and gun violence, I know, will be left in our history books and not in our headlines.
Manisha.
Also want to say thank you for this incredible panel, and those two answers basically sums up what I was thinking. And the piece that I would add on to that is about access, because as Chris mentioned, this is preventable. As David mentioned, this is targeting certain communities. And for me, this is a very personal issue. I was a sophomore in college, and I was going to a party, like many sophomores do, and there was an argument over a football game. And one of the kids pulled out a firearm to end that argument. And as a result, 4 of my classmates were shot and 1 was killed. And this is, as we've already acknowledged, is so preventable. The question I asked was why? Was there a gun at this party? How did this 19-year-old kid have access to this firearm? Why did he bring it to the party? And I think it just becomes this symbol of power, of this culture that America has said that they own and embrace, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can be the country that is the country of responsible gun ownership, of gun safety, of making sure that we're not getting firearms in the wrong hands. That's so much of the work that we've done, and I think those numbers have spoken for themselves in the policies that have passed across the country. We already heard a couple of times that we're at record lows on violent crimes and homicides, and it's because of all the work that's been done on this issue. And it really does make a difference. I've been at Everytown for about 7 years now, and one of the things, the biggest change I've seen that I think is really worth noting is people didn't used to talk about this issue. Yeah. It was a third rail issue. It was something that we were like, oh, this is just not something we legislate on, this is not something that we talk in politics on, because nothing can be done. And we've actually seen a huge change of that. People are talking about the issue, they're acknowledging that it's an epidemic in this country, and they're starting to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'm just enjoying sitting here listening. I think to add on, so first and foremost, Youth Alive, we are a public health violence prevention organization. And so what I wish more people understood about gun violence is what we mean when we say it's a public health issue. Addressing violence as a public health issue is about addressing both the immediate harm and, as David said, the structures and the environment that create the conditions for that harm to actually happen. So to give you how clear the data is, where we're at in Oakland, California. So in Alameda County, gun violence is the leading cause of death for children and young adults throughout the county. And just living in a community with high rates of violence for at least 5 years has impacts on your health throughout your life course. That means you'll have higher risk of chronic conditions such as hypertension and diabetes. So even if you don't directly experience it, you're still gonna feel those impacts. In public health, we often use what we call the upstream-downstream analogy. So imagine that you walk upon a river and you see someone drowning. You rush in to help that person. But as you're helping that person, another person passes by you, and then another. And at some point you ask yourself, why are people falling in this river in the first place? And so for us at Youth Alive, that's what it means to approach violence as a public health issue. We meet the immediate crisis. We help people survive, we help them heal, and we stabilize them. But we're also working upstream, changing the systems and environments that put people at risk in the first place. And as was said up here, violence is preventable, but only if we treat it with the urgency, care, and strategy we bring to every other public health crisis.
Juliet.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your leadership, of course, in the state. I have the honor of doing a lot of work with your Office of Gun Violence Prevention in various capacities, and of course, everybody here for your work in California and nationally, and for all of you for being here. What I would just add is that I think there's urgency around the idea that too many people in the country have been convinced that having a firearm makes them safer. And that we don't do enough to ensure that people understand that there are particular instances in which it is very dangerous to have a firearm or multiple firearms. And we have policies that we've developed over time, and certainly in California, we've had, for example, a prohibition in the domestic violence context for over 30 years. But implementation lagged. And until we invested the resources, until we really focused on what does it take, and sometimes what it takes, and I know this because we worked on the court forms, is not having a checkbox on a form, because that checkbox gets missed. And instead of saying you are prohibited, there's no checkbox. You are prohibited when a restraining order is in place, for example. It could be as simple as that. But we need to have those conversations about what it takes to have effective and fair implementation. And then I'd also say the other aspect of this is everyone has noted, the preventable aspect is that we can all do something about firearms violence prevention. That means if you're an attorney and you're working on child custody issues, you have a role to play in terms of talking about how high conflict in the home may require a temporary period of time where firearms are removed from the home or safely stored in other instances. If you're looking at domestic violence, 2/3 of mass shootings have some connection to domestic violence. And similarly, in terms of marginalization and access to resources, we know there's a gendered component to how domestic violence is often perpetrated, disproportionately impacting women, and the presence of the firearm leading to lethal outcomes and serious injuries more often than not. So we need to zero in on those kinds of issues and learn that if we're working with folks who are experiencing domestic violence, we need to be screening for the presence of firearms, sometimes owned by the victim survivor because they've been told they'd be safer, and not understanding the risks inherent in that. So we need to see our role. If you're a pediatrician, I've talked to friends who have said, I get asked more about sunscreen than I do about firearms in the home. Sunscreen's important. I'm not here to tell you it isn't. But having those conversations with family members, with patients about why under certain circumstances, removing firearms temporarily is critical. Given the prevalence of gun ownership, it's critical that we be having those conversations, and we all have a role to play in being better informed about what we can do to prevent these horrific outcomes.
I want to turn to David. And after surviving the tragic shooting at your high school, you helped launch one of the largest youth-led movements in the history of our nation, and you moved conservative lawmakers in Florida to pass real reform in a matter of weeks. And we'd like if you could share with the audience more about how March for Our Lives grew out of that experience, both the organization and the mass protests that we're all so familiar with. And then fast forward to 2025, what's the next chapter in that ongoing work?
Absolutely. I think the lessons that we learned from that is one, that it takes a village. The kids from Parkland get a lot of the credit and attention. You don't hear nearly enough as much about the parents of the kids who died doing the work of lobbying under enormous emotional distress and pushing to create those changes. You don't hear about the doctors and nurses that showed up there. You don't hear about the people like the moms that led the first, one of the first marches in our movement, the Million Mom March, in 2000, I think it was, that helped to lay the groundwork for what we do. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm not here to act like this is something new that we were doing. We were extremely angry, to be clear, over what happened, but it's not like what we were doing was something brand new or anything like that. I think what was unique about how we, as a generation, have experienced this issue and then had that happen in Parkland is you had a unique situation where our state legislature was actually in session at that time. And this is extremely unfortunate that it has to be this way, but frankly, it was an election year that it was happening in a swing state, or what used to be a swing state. And you had a group of young people that had a ridiculously well-resourced and well-funded high school with things like a TV production program and a speech and debate program that I was the beneficiary of, where I learned about things like gun control policy, where I had to argue on both sides of it in speech and debate. And because I wanted to be a broadcast journalist at the time, I had experience talking on camera because of TV production, as did many of the co-founders of March for Our Lives. And the result of that was that when we went out there and spoke, many people thought that we were actors, that they thought that we were paid by the government. No, I'm serious. They thought that. But it says a lot more about how people view our education system and how little faith they have in it than anything, right? The fact that it was more believable to them that we worked for the FBI or the CIA or some other three-letter agency than the fact that our education system could have actually done its job was really unique in enabling us to do this, because we were like, oh yeah, we can show up at our state legislature. Oh yeah, we are a community that has a lot of privilege and wealth and powerful people that come from it and are related to it that want to help. So that when we showed up at the state legislature, even though communities before us had showed up there to try to demand action on this, unfortunately, because it happened to us and we had the political accessibility of actually being able to pressure them more and the timing of it, we were able to change those laws. But what I will say is it didn't come from asking nicely. I think that I think history has a way of sanitizing these movements, of being like, oh yeah, like that was always going to happen. No, it wasn't, right? We had to go out there and scream and demand action and scare the hell out of a lot of politicians. And to the point that I remember saying in the early days of March for Our Lives, the only good politician is one that is scared of losing their job. I still kind of believe that to some extent, present company excluded. But it's true, right? No matter how corrupt a politician is or how ethical they are, the only thing that all of them care about is staying in power. And until you come directly for that, they do not care. They will give you as much damn lip service as possible. But until you say, you better get your damn resume ready because we're coming for your job, they do not care. And that's what we did. We had, I think before us that the attitude was kind of like, oh, like, let's go and ask nicely because what happened to us was so tragic. And it was horrible, but that didn't work nearly as much, right? And when you have a group of young people that are saying so obviously what the right thing is to do, it has a way of moving those politicians to do the right thing. And, it helped to inspire people like Maxwell Frost to join us in organizing for the March for Our Lives, who then ended up working for the organization and then decided to run for Congress and getting elected to become the first Gen Z member of Congress. And, what we're trying to do now with Leaders We Deserve is take a lot of those young people, the millions of them that walked out of their schools, that protested with us, and say, all right, cool. If our government isn't going to change our gun laws and address this fast enough, we'll just change who's in government. Or better yet, even if that doesn't succeed, we will outlive who is in government and then change who is in government.
Thank you. And I just want to comment on and put a double click on your emphasis on people power and how powerful it is, more potent than the people in power, and the reminder of who the boss is, that the people are the boss of the elected officials, not the other way around, which sometimes gets mixed up, and how a movement fueled by anger, pain, tragedy can lead to great change, but also how some decided to take a step into positional power and bring their lived experience into that role, instead of asking someone to make the change, making the change themselves and knowing what is needed, as Congressman Frost has done. So thank you for touching on all those different points. I want to turn to Julia for a second. You've led on policy implementation and implementation at every level of this work, especially at the intersection of gun violence and domestic violence. And in this moment when we're watching courts and we're watching the Trump administration question even basic protections for survivors, what are the most urgent dangers, and how should we be responding?
Well, thank you for the question. I think some of the urgent dangers include what I've already mentioned, which is the notion that too many people are being convinced by the industry, because the firearms industry needs customers. They need to sell their products, and they're being convinced that they need to own firearms and they're safer with firearms. So we need to be aware of that. I work often with folks who are interacting directly with victims of intimate partner violence. And even if some of those screening tools that they're using mention, traditionally in the last few years, they've added questions like, does the abuser, the person perpetrating the harm, own a firearm? That sounds like an improvement, and it is, over not mentioning anything about firearms as a possible risk for lethality or serious injury. But we know that we have to ask about your access to firearms as a survivor and victim. We need to ask not just about ownership, but the presence of firearms. So I think there's an urgency around counteracting that messaging and not assuming that it's only bad guys with guns. Firearms are prevalent. They're owned by people across race, class, gender. The experience of firearms violence disproportionately impacts certain communities, and there are higher risks in certain instances. But getting a better sense of how prevalent the risks are, I think, is critical. And then understanding how we can take action. One of the things we did in California is we changed the law regarding licensing of hairdressers. This was years ago, so that they had to learn about domestic violence. Because that's often who clients might confide in, right? So we've also changed the law in California so that child custody mediators and evaluators, people who have direct contact with parents who are in litigation, arguing over custody and visitation, those folks, those professionals have to learn about risks associated with access to firearms and how to reduce those risks. So just thinking about every aspect of how this might come up, and not just relying on law enforcement or the courts. Certainly investing in those important system actors is critical, but also recognizing that we have other ways of addressing the public health crisis. I think there's a lot of urgency for me around that.
Thank you. So let's, next question will be a little bit of a speed round, just a quick reaction or response. We can start with Julie and come back this way. It's my magic wand question. So if we had a magic wand, if we could wish into reality nationwide, collective action at scale, the federal administration, the states all doing the same thing to make the biggest impact on gun violence, what should we as a nation do?
Well, that's a big question. What comes to mind, and I know this might sound overly simplistic, but another thing we did in California that I think is doable, so magic wand is good, but also I'm going to think about something we could do right away, is that we are requiring that courts provide information on how people can comply when they become prohibited from having firearms. That sounds pretty straightforward. But there's nowhere else in the country that was doing that. And we have data now that shows when people get good information about the prohibition and they know there'll be some follow-up, they more often than not comply. And the closer in time we get to when someone becomes prohibited and they're separated from any firearms that they currently owned, the risk is reduced not only for the person who might be protected under a domestic violence restraining order, but also risks around suicide in an extreme risk protection order case, risk for law enforcement, and risks for the broader community. So I would like to see us do something as simple as that, is make sure people get good information, reduce unnecessary exposure to the criminal legal system. We don't need to be picking people up for violating restraining orders if they've been given a real opportunity in accessible ways that they can separate from their firearms. So I think it's a fair and effective way to make real the promise of these state and federal policies.
So show the pathway, remove barriers, make it clear what needs to be done, and then that way you can get the implementation of the policy at scale.
Absolutely, make these policies more accessible, because really all of us up here who advocate for violence prevention policies, we don't just want the policies, we want the implementation.
Right.
Right? They're only as good as the implementation, and that's what we all need to be focused on.
Thank you. Dr. Griffin.
All right, and I'm going to bring Oakland into the room, so I'm going to speak from the local standpoint. Fully fund all of the violence prevention programs that address violence today, but also the intergenerational trauma that we experience in our community. I have some partners out here from other programs throughout Oakland, and while I am very proud of what we do at Youth Alive, we do not do that in a silo. And so when one of our programs lacks the funding or resources, we all suffer, and so does our community. So in Oakland, last year, we ended the year about a 30% decrease in homicide and gun violence. This year, we're on track for the same. This year, we're also losing resources, right? So it's with that heart that we're going to keep moving forward. However, while we know that something is working, at the same time, let's also fund effective research and evaluation with academic partners that want to do research with communities, not on communities, so that we're actually controlling our narrative and that we are saying this is what's happening beyond the reduction in homicide, beyond the reduction in gun assault, but even how are we intervening on those social determinants of health, right? That housing, that food security, when we're talking about how do you navigate broken healthcare systems, how do we show that that is a part of a holistic view of violence prevention? And how do we wrap our arms truly around the community to help it heal?
Thank you. Manisha.
It's really tough going third. No, I think that we often, when we're having these conversations, we always focus on the violence, and I would go like 10 steps backwards and would really look to invest in schools, in healthcare, in jobs, in really making sure that we're taking care of our community at their core, at the really basic level, because I often feel like this issue happens because people feel like they don't have options. And when you take away their option, the only option left is violence. And so if we really make sure we're investing in our communities, all of our communities, then we can really get to the root of this issue.
Great point. And I just want to make a quick point on that. With some of the violence intervention programs that have been implemented in different cities, different stories and different facts have emerged, including that in Stockton, when there was an analysis and study looking at who was picking up guns and shooting. It was largely folks who were housing, didn't have housing, didn't have a job, didn't have food, and when given a job, housing, and food, made different choices and put down the guns and no longer engaged in violence. So opportunity investments can reduce violence, absolutely. Thank you for that. David.
Repeal PLCAA. First and foremost, the law that stops us from holding the gun industry accountable the same way that we can hold other industries accountable. Personally, I think in the United States, if you cannot have a viable business selling firearms to people that only the most responsible gun owners, you shouldn't have a business, period. The responsibility should also be on these companies to ensure that if they are selling a firearm, it is to only the most responsible, well-trained people possible. And if they don't, they should get sued into oblivion. And because that's the way that we went after big tobacco. And that is not possible right now because of PLCAA. The other thing that I would say is that we need a system. If we're going to say that we have a well-regulated militia, even in the most originalistic of interpretations, that means well-trained. I think if you want to have a firearm in the United States, you should have a similar level of training to somebody in the National Guard, and that gun should be registered. Because if we need to call up the militia, how are we supposed to call it up if we don't know who has the guns? Controversial take, I know. The other thing that I would say is that I think we need a tax similar to what you guys have here in California on firearms sales and firearms related paraphernalia, specifically earmarked to fund violence intervention programs and research from the federal government. Right now, we get about $25 million at the NIH and CDC to study gun violence. Sepsis kills about the same number of people every year as guns. It gets over $1 billion a year in research funding from the federal government. So fund that. And then on top of that, I would also say have very targeted violence intervention programs that do not only focus on gun homicide, but also we need to pioneer in the movement some version of that for gun suicide. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but we've got to do more there. I also think that we should figure out a way to phase out lead ammunition in the country and the lead products that go into firearms that poison our communities and poison the victims of gun violence as well, that we also know are very highly correlated with crime. As some of you may know, there's something called the lead crime hypothesis, that the levels, one of the best predictors of if somebody becomes a violent criminal later on in life is the level of lead in their blood as a child. And there was a major drop in the 90s in violent crime, or after the 90s. And one of the theories for that is because we banned leaded gasoline 20 years prior. And if people are getting shot and getting lead in them, I think that may be part of the problem. And figuring out some way of federalizing, the same way we did with like Obamacare, federalizing Massachusetts state gun laws or California state gun laws, or combining the best of both worlds. I don't care, just get it done. Federalizing those, and In terms of violence intervention, I think we got to stop overcomplicating it. We know that in most cities, it's basically under 5,000 people that are by far the most likely individuals to be the perpetrators or victims of gun violence. We need to offer wraparound social services to each and every one of those individuals to get them housing, to get them a job, to get them therapy, and get them any of the other resources that they need so that they do not pick up a gun. Not only because of the moral element of it, but because it is economically smart. It will save us, I kid you not, billions of dollars if we did that in every single city in the country. And we will save law enforcement lives by not putting them in harm's way, because there will be less shootings that happen.
Chris.
Well, shockingly, I agree with everything that's been said. I will say, to add some value here, I'll go up about 30,000 feet and just say, broadly speaking, unrigging the system. That would be my wish. Because everything that's described is about a rigged system. And I can think of few things in American life, with guns the #1 killer of our kids in this country, and the disparate impact of gun violence in communities of color in this country, that's not traceable in a material way to a law David referenced, PLACA, that provides purported, because we still sue and win sometimes, purported immunity to the gun industry. There is no other industry in American life that is given this shield. And I want to give a context for why this is so critically infectious to our ability to solve this issue. What happens if you have an entire industry that is immune from liability? You don't invest in R&D. Why don't we have smart guns on the market? You don't actually manage your supply chain. Every gun manufacturer in this country tomorrow could stop, if they wanted to, the 5% of gun dealers in this country, and by the way, we have more gun dealers in this country than McDonald's and Starbucks combined, okay? 5% of them are responsible for 90% of the guns recovered in crime. Why is that? Because the dealers keep selling to them. I mean, the manufacturers keep selling to those dealers. They never shut them off because their motive is profit. And what I find when I go across this country is we have so much in common, whether you're a gun owner or not a gun owner, around this issue. But so many people don't know about these facts. They don't understand that the system is rigged. So the magic wand I want is for people in America to understand that this industry is no different than the opioid industry. The opioid industry, it's now understood what the Sacklers did. That's what the manufacturers of guns and a few of the dealers are doing to profit off of carnage. And everyone in America should be really mad about that and do something.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. We got the vision for where we can go, what we could accomplish together, and I am particularly supportive of the answers that include California as a model and a blueprint to use those common sense life-saving laws and bring them to more places. I've always believed that, and California can and should still do more, but we've been proud to be a leader here. Bringing us back to reality, we have a federal administration that seems antagonistic towards many of the steps that you have shared, the vision that you have just articulated, and have an administration that seems to be cozying up to the NRA. So with that vacuum, and in President Biden's administration, we had a Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I will say California had ours first, just a note to point out an observation, and someone who was interested and focused on tackling gun violence and improving safety in our communities. We don't have that now, so we have a vacuum. How do we fill that vacuum? And who can fill it, whether it be states or local communities, NGOs, nonprofits, community-based organizations. Love your perspective on that. And To make sure you don't go third, let's go to Monisha.
Thank you. You kind of said it. States are doing an incredible job in filling this gap. Right now, we have seen victories in places like Rhode Island, who just recently passed an assault weapons ban, and Colorado that did something similar. In Tennessee and Alabama, we were able to see Glock switches get banned. The fact that you're seeing what is traditionally known as red states stepping up and filling the gap and saying, like, actually, we don't want these violent outcomes happening here in our states is like a huge part of this conversation. States have been leading the way, and they'll continue to lead the way. I'm really proud to say that California may have been first with starting an Office of Gun Violence Prevention, but my home state of Delaware started one the day after the Trump administration took office, where they shut theirs down, and Delaware said, we're going to step up to the plate.
Love it.
So we're just seeing the states constantly like get together and fill that gap. Our history of Everytown started with mayors, and being able to see local mayors really like take the moment and acknowledge that they're partnering with law enforcement, they're partnering in community groups, they're continuing to invest in their communities and really like lead the way on this issue, not in always a legislative way, but just an investment way, talking about it, bringing community centers together and different communities together to really address it.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's go to Dr. Griffin, and we'll wrap back around.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of thoughts I have on it. One, I think states are doing a great job, right? In California, we have CalVIP, which is our state funding for violence intervention prevention services that creates a baseline throughout the state, which is amazing work. I think as we've talked about here is that violence prevention intervention is not just a criminal justice issue. It's not just a public health issue, right? It's also a workforce development issue. It's a housing issue. It's an education issue. So it really does require us working at those intersections of our fields in order to address this in our communities. And I also want to say that it is unacceptable for the federal government to step back from this work. And we have to hold them accountable, and we have to keep pushing. The federal government provides almost a quarter of funding for all community-based organizations. You cannot take that partner away from the table and expect us to figure it out. So we still need to hold the federal government's feet to the fire and say, you are a part of this. This is part of your responsibility.
I would just add, I work primarily in California, but do a lot of work nationally, and I often run into this idea that, it must be easy in California because it's not a red state. We have complexity and diversity in our state as well. It's part of the United States, and there's such a strong commitment to providing access to firearms across the United States. This is not a red state or a blue state issue. I actually find that responsible gun owners are the most amenable to ideas about when is it appropriate to separate people from their firearms, and safe storage being an important component of responsible gun ownership, and being fair and effective in ensuring that we implement these policies. I think you can do that across every level and across all the different political spectrums. I think it's really important to not feel defeated by this idea that this can only happen because this group of people is supportive of gun control. We're seeing the policies, as my colleagues up here have already indicated, and I would just say, let's give some concrete examples of things we've done, like requiring education for the professionals that I've already mentioned, investing in safe storage options, making sure that we acknowledge the prevalence of gun ownership, and providing ways to take that seriously, again, as a public health issue. But I think when we think about, Americans are concerned about crime, absolutely, and we have to be real about what kind of crime we're talking about. And some of that is criminal access to crime goods. That's a big chunk of it, right? So let's address that. Let's deal with the trafficking, with the dealers. Let's tackle so-called ghost guns. I think that there's much we can do at the state and local level. And again, I see that possible across the country, not just in California.
Thank you.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think that one of the things just to add is the role of private philanthropy in all of this. Obviously, we have seen during the Biden administration incredible investments, necessary investments, overdue investments made in gun violence prevention and education around things like extreme risk protection laws and huge and historic investments in community violence intervention. Horribly, this administration has targeted all of those investments, and they've done it in insidious ways because they don't want it in the light of day. They do it behind the scenes. But gun violence is the #1 killer of our kids. We know it has a disparate impact in communities of color. There are huge foundations across this country, I can name many, that are very active and very involved in those kinds of issues, focused on kids and wellness and all kinds of things that are extremely important. I would never say don't make those investments. What I would say is if you look at those large foundation investments and count the number of dollars that are spent on gun violence prevention, it's usually about this.
Yeah.
That has to shift. That has to change, because the reason we have seen across this country huge reductions in homicide rates over the last several years is not an accident. It's because we have passed the right kinds of policies, not just in California with your leadership, but in other states too. And at the federal level, there was a commitment to this that we have never seen in our lifetime, and dollars matter. So my ask would be for philanthropists and those who have investments to make to really look at the data, the work that's being done by so many different organizations across this country that is relatively underfunded, but can be catalytic. Huge return on investment, because it is an intersectional issue. And you fix this issue, and you can fix a lot of other connected issues along the way.
David.
What was the question?
In the federal administration's,
Right, okay,
with their
I remember.
inaction, the vacuum they left, who should be stepping up and how?
So I'm going to propose a bit of a radical idea. Our states, like California and others, buy billions of dollars in guns for law enforcement. I don't know exactly what this looks like, but I've just thought of it up here. I think some of our blue states should probably consider who they're purchasing their firearms from and say, actually, if you don't meet certain requirements of micro-stamping for all of your firearms, if you don't meet certain requirements of, for example, did you guys know that guns are not regulated by the Consumer Protection Act? Toy guns are actually more regulated because they got to have the orange thing on the end. So that means that if you buy a gun in most states in this country, it does not have to pass a drop test, so that if you drop it, it goes off, for example. And I think some of our states, because they're going to keep buying these firearms, they should use that power to negotiate with these companies and say, actually, if you're going to do that, you need to meet these requirements and ensure that you are not selling to that 5% of gun dealers that are fueling the very gun violence that our law enforcement officers are having to go out and fight back against and often die for, right? Because why should we be arming them too? And I think the other thing that we need to consider is we need our state governments, California's done some of this, but we need our state governments to step up more in funding research on gun violence in the place that if the CDC and NIH are not willing to step up there because they don't have the funding from Congress, our states that do have Democratic trifectas should be doing it in their place and leading the way. And you can also create jobs at the same time while doing it in your states. And making sure that you're doing everything you can to crack down on gun trafficking into states with weaker gun laws. You know, the shootings that happen in DC are rarely with firearms that are actually purchased legally within the bounds of the district. And something as simple as a 1 gun per month policy, where it says you can't buy more than 1 gun per month, could help us combat that. We also need to address the fact that there's a lot of guns that come from our red states into Mexico that then arm the cartels, which then drive part of our immigration crisis at the same time. So those are just some of the ways that we should step up.
Thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Griffin. As the executive director of Youth Alive, you lead the organization that developed the nation's first hospital-based violence intervention program. So can you tell us more about Youth Alive's story, the hospital-based violence intervention model, and the work the organization does to prevent gun violence in Oakland?
Yeah, absolutely, Attorney General. And most of my notes are about that, so I'm going to keep those closed to kind of keep us on time. Youth Alive, we've been around since 1991 in Oakland, California. We actually first started with a program called Teens on Target. And Teens on Target is our peer education program where high school peer educators learn a violence prevention curriculum that they then teach in the middle schools that they came from. And so 16 years ago, when I first joined Youth Alive, I actually ran one of our Teens on Target programs at Oakland High. And that was my introduction to this work. But before me, back in the early 90s, led by a credible leader named Sherman Spears, who was a survivor of violence himself, Youth Alive began to realize that there was something we called the golden moment, right? This is a moment immediately after injury at the hospital bedside when a young person is in a place that they never saw themselves. And we had a feeling that if we can create a connection and work with that young person in that moment, we can break a cycle of violence and we could help them on their healing journey. And so that created Calm the Crossfire. And as Attorney General mentioned, that is the first hospital-based violence intervention program, period. And so in the HVIP model, what we do is we meet survivors of violence at the hospital bedside in the trauma center. We begin to build trust and we begin to help them stabilize, whether that's physically, mentally, emotionally. We also start to check for any sort of retaliatory violence. And we try to quell any of that in the community. From there, we work with and walk with those individuals over the next 12 months on their healing journey, right? Getting that mental, emotional, physical support, connected to housing security, re-engage in school, re-engage with employment, really everything they need to move forward from where they are. And so last year, we served 113 survivors of violence, primarily in Oakland, California, with only one of those people being re-injured.
Mm.
That's awesome.
Amazing. Let's turn to Monisha. Everytown and Moms Demand Action have reshaped the advocacy landscape in just over a decade. And here in California, you've led on major initiatives like CalVIP and AB 1127, which tackles so-called Glock switches. Tell us more about why these issues are so urgent right now and how you're building support and finding success in the current environment.
Sure. So you've heard this mentioned quite a few times of like who's benefiting right now from gun violence. It's the gun industry. And when you have a federal government who is literally deregulating silencers, when we're trying to pay for community violence, we're trying to have an election that is allegedly about the cost of eggs, you're having silencers now with no taxes. It's really great to be able to work on a policy like AB 1127. I want to thank you for being supportive of it, which is really taking that issue home. Where David said, we got to stop being nice, and this policy does that. It says we are no longer going to allow for a pistol that is easily converted to be accessible in the marketplace. That's simple. Machine guns have been illegal in this country for decades. They should not be legal now. And what a Glock switch does, it's something that looks like a Lego piece. Some children carry these on their keychains. They can be printed very easily, can be attached to a pistol, and all of a sudden you have a regular handgun that can now shoot off 1,100 rounds in a minute. Why is that allowed? We know that the industry can easily fix this. We know this is not a, difficult thing for them to do. They simply haven't. And so we now have to force their hand. And this is exactly what this policy will do. We're really excited for the lawmakers here in California to be taking this on, to be the first in the country to really lead the way. And I look forward to coming back to California, hopefully at the end of this session, for a bill signing.
I want to turn to a question from the audience. Polls show that most Americans support universal background checks and other safety measures, yet Congress remains gridlocked. What does this disconnect reveal about our political system? And I doubt David has any opinions about this one. But anyone could jump in on this.
I think you can lead, David.
It reveals that we have a non-majoritarian system of government that is representative of land more than it is of people. Thanks to the filibuster in the Senate, which was developed as a tool predominantly to defend white supremacy and Jim Crow, we are still finding ourselves at an impasse at passing common sense legislation supported by the vast majority of the American people by a institution that pretty much directly was created to defend slavery, which is the United States Senate. And that's a radical thing to say, but I do not care. It needs to be said. And we're still, it's one more example of how we are living the consequences of those policies to this day of injustice that then results in more gun violence, where we have a system where the vast majority of people can want something, but not only need 51 votes in the Senate, we need 60 to break through the filibuster. And, you know, it's a delicate topic because obviously we don't want it to be used against us if we, you know, aren't in the majority at the same time. But at the end of the day, we need the ability to pass legislation, and Democrats need to have the courage to actually at least create a carve out for guns when it comes to the filibuster to get something done on it at the end of the day and really dramatically have an impact on this instead of just constantly paying the political price for being supportive of these rules and these laws every election cycle. So I think that's what it represents. And then also it represents the power of a tiny minority of people that are extremely loud. Mm-hmm. I do think as well, though, we have to make sure that when we're passing these laws that we are talking not only with survivors, of course, but also talking with experts on how firearms actually work and making sure that we're not creating policies that just draw more resentment than they actually are effective a lot of the time. And I think that's one thing that we need to reflect on. We also need to address the fact that, you know, we don't see a lot of mass shootings being committed with machine guns necessarily, unless it's something like a bump stock. That's not necessarily only because it's because they're extremely hard to get. You can still buy one, but it is as a Class 3 firearm typically with a very high standard of ownership that is highly regulated. And it turns out that gun laws actually work, right? Are they perfect? No. But somebody like the shooter at my high school, was he a criminal? Yes, obviously. But he was not a mastermind. He was a 19-year-old who wanted to kill a lot of people and was able to legally purchase, despite not being able to purchase a handgun because he was not 21 yet. Under federal law, if you're purchasing a gun from a federally licensed dealer, you cannot purchase a handgun unless you're above the age of 21. He could purchase an AR-15.
Yeah. Just
because that is the logic of the NRA. So that's what I would say about what that reveals about our political system and the dramatic need for campaign finance reform as well.
Chris, I want to turn to you. We started a little bit of discussion around PLCAA, and Brady has long led the charge for gun industry accountability, even when the odds were stacked high. Tell us about what you're doing to hold the industry accountable in court and in Congress, despite PLCAA.
Yes. Well, PLCAA has been around for over 2 decades, and it was in response to Brady's litigation that was actually causing huge settlements with the gun industry. And similar to what David is saying around, well, why do we have this problem? It's because there were too many elected officials who were happy to take the NRA money and then pass a bill like PLCAA that purported to stop all litigation against gun manufacturers. Brady didn't just stop litigation after that. There are certain exceptions to PLCAA, and we found a way to continue to focus on negligence of dealers, right? Theories of liability that allow a case to go forward that sort of skirt PLCAA. We've also worked really hard with folks like Attorney General Bonta and other leaders across the country to pass state legislation. And now we have 10 states that have passed legislation, including the great state of California, that provide an exception pursuant to PLCAA that allow cases to proceed under state law against manufacturers with certain theories of liability. And we are steadfastly reviewing the facts and circumstances pursuant to which those cases can be brought, because we firmly believe that if we can get enough information, and you'd be surprised how easily it is obtainable, on the dealers, those 5% of dealers that are supplying the 90% of crime guns, we can bring cases against those dealers and the upstream manufacturers that are supplying those dealers. And once we do in enough states, and that's why passing the legislation has been so key, we will get discovery. And what we're going to find when we get discovery is a lot of information and interesting conversations that are going on in the C-suite about how these manufacturers are targeting our children, how they are knowingly, there's something under the law called willful blindness, how they are making sure that they are not monitoring the supply chain. And that's why these cases are so important, because they will be game changers once we're able to bring them.
Awesome. I'll just mention that we did have a question about, that points out that Connecticut just enacted a firearm industry liability bill. The question is, where's California on this? Chris just answered that question, that California had moved on that same issue earlier. 10 states now,
Yeah.
40 to go.
That's right.
So some talk about California and the record that we have in success addressing gun violence and making our communities safer. Of course, part of being great means knowing when you're falling short, knowing when you need to do more, always striving to be better. So in that spirit, this question is being asked. What blind spots or weaknesses remain in California's approach that you think need to be addressed before it can be a true national blueprint? What more can we do in California? Anyone feel free to jump in on this one.
Well, I'll start us off. I think we have so much to be proud of, and one example is we've already talked about the tax that has generated some funding for community violence intervention. We also had a one-time allocation of state funding, $40 million. For firearms relinquishment implementation. And I've mentioned this area of policy a few times. It's particularly important because you look at the most recent U.S. Supreme Court decision addressing the intersection of domestic violence and firearms, U.S. versus Rahimi, where the Supreme Court upheld, in an 8-1 decision, upheld the federal prohibition in domestic violence restraining order cases, which is huge. It seems sort of obvious. Why would we want people who had been restrained in domestic violence cases from having firearms? But it was a fight, and we won that battle. But if we, again, don't fund implementation, it's a lost cause. It doesn't have the life-saving implications that are so critical. So in California, we had a couple of years ago, $40 million. They actually, a couple of us who were advocating for this, we had talked with them about a $10 million pilot project, because that was all we thought we could get. Uvalde happened, and the day Uvalde happened, I was called out of a training where I was training judicial officers on this issue, and I can tell you, sitting in a room full of judicial officers who make these decisions every day about who should have a firearm in domestic violence cases and child custody cases, and then dealing with the horrific realization of what had just happened in Texas. I was called out of that training because some legislators said, what if we gave you $40 million to implement these policies? So they found the money, which is extraordinary. And we've been implementing these pilot programs, these efforts around firearms relinquishment, primarily in domestic violence civil cases, some criminal restraining order cases, and in gun violence restraining order matters. But it's one-time funding. It's one-time funding. So this is not a one-time issue. This is an ongoing issue. And we had over 20 firearms violence prevention policies signed by the governor in the fall in this state, which is extraordinary. And we need to be able to back that up with resources. So I would just say, I know that's a tough issue in California as we struggle with budget constraints, but we need to recognize that as long as this is an ongoing issue, we've got to adequately fund these really important policies.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in on this? Yeah.
And I like to bring, so this is actually a gap that we saw that we're attempting to fill right now. And it is a new program that we have at Youth Alive, and it's called the G Vital Institute. So it stands for Gun Violence Interruption Through Action Learning. It's a partnership between Youth Alive, Advanced Peace, and the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Go Bears. And so one of the things that we recognize that, and the whole field has changed in less than a year, but as the field was progressing, we were starting to see it get more professionalized. And core to community violence intervention work has always been, how do we center community experience that then becomes community expertise? Because those are the folks who are actually doing the work in the community. So together, we're creating an institute that has two focuses. One, on training for frontline staff. Training for most organizations is a capacity issue, right? Do you have enough training? How do you actually build curriculum? How do you get enough people to learn those basic skills? We're trying to bring people together regionally to do that. The second is what I got back to, which is action research. Again, how do we bring in community experts and academic experts in true partnership to do this research? One of the biggest problems we have is that we can't tell our own stories through our own data. We don't understand how to analyze it. We're not even part of creating the research questions to really get at the heart of what we're doing. So we want to create space for the academics at UC Berkeley and our experts in the Greater Bay Area to really get together and build that research together.
Love it. Thank you. I want to turn to our final question. We'll start with Dr. Griffin again, and we'll kind of loop around, finish with Monisha. You've all chosen to stay in this work, even though it's hard. It's grueling, dangerous, draining, and right now, the political winds seem to be shifting hard against the goals and the mission that you're pursuing. So what gives you hope? What sustains you? What gives you confidence that the next decade can look different from the last, not just for policy wins, but also for the possibility of real cultural change?
Absolutely. So I think staying in the work is interesting for me because it's actually my third time working at Youth Alive. So I keep coming back. Work keeps calling me back. But first and foremost, it's personal. Right? I grew up in Richmond, California, with high rates of violence. It's great that actually my older brother, Ezekiel Griffin, who grew up with me in Richmond, California, is here today because it's personal. It's professional because, as I shared with you all, I started as a frontline staff member, right? Working directly with young people in our community. And it's academic. I went back to school in order to figure out how do we build those partnerships with our academic partners who are 10 to 20 minutes away, but it feels like they're forever away. So I really find hope, and I really feel excited about living at the intersection of those three spaces, because I think it really does require all of us working together to really address the issues that we see in our communities.
Thank you.
Well, I think about this a lot. I've been in this work for over 30 years, and I have lived through, we don't talk about this, it's a non-issue, and I've seen the progress, which is incredibly rewarding. I also am motivated every day by the memories of people I've lost. It's very personal. My son is a young man of color in his 20s who grew up here in San Francisco. And again, people say, San Francisco, not an issue in terms of firearms violence. Absolutely untrue. Our family has lost too many people, too many young people. It's just become part and parcel of his life and our lives here in the city and, of course, across the country. So I think about the children, the young people, all the different types of firearm violence that has impacted those folks, and their stories are on my mind every day as I do the policy work. How can we fix the gap that led to that outcome? And then I'm also motivated by the headlines that don't have to get written. As there are so many things that don't happen because of people like all of you here on the stage, people in the audience, people I get to work with every day. It's the violence that we can prevent and the tragedies that never happen, and that just keeps me going, because I would much rather be doing something about this than be struggling reading those kinds of headlines and not knowing what to do, because we can make a difference, and we do. So thank you all.
Chris.
Well, I've been working on the issue of gun violence prevention really since I was in my 20s and worked on Capitol Hill in the 90s and got to meet Jim and Sarah Brady. The person I worked for was one of the key whips for the Brady bill that finally, after 6 years and 7 votes, became law. So our organization was founded by people who never give up. And I think that's sort of my DNA as a human being, the way that I was raised. And for me as a mom, listening to everything that David shares, my daughter was inspired by March for Our Lives. She went and protested Mitch McConnell, got arrested, taken to jail. It was on CNN. I was here in California and I saw her. I don't want this to be an issue that someone as talented as David Hogg or my own daughter Katie or others are working on through their lives. And I don't want to look at an America where I believe that I am a very patriotic American, but we're not living up to the ideal of an America. We cannot call ourselves the land of the free and the home of the brave. And that was always an ideal because we know the stain of slavery and everything else in this country. But ultimately, the issue of gun violence for us is solvable. And I cannot rest knowing there's so many survivors I've met that have come to this country for a better life and lost loved ones here in America. That, to me, is a great stain on our country, and one that I feel every day compelled to try and make a difference on.
It's what gives me hope are first and foremost the predominantly women that have done this work for decades, often Black and brown women that have done this work for decades and have never ever gotten the credit that they deserve, like Erica Ford in Jamaica, Queens, who leads an incredible violence intervention program there called Life Camp and founded it in, I think it was 2002, and led it for 20 years to be eventually a network of hundreds of nonprofits across New York City called the New York City Crisis Management System to reduce gun violence. And how many more people are out there like her that you will never know that do not get invited on stages like this, that absolutely deserve to be here 1,000 times more than I do, but have nonetheless continued to do this work every single day, despite not getting the credit, despite not getting attention, and doing it with 1,000 times fewer resources than anybody on this stage has. And the other two people that I would say give me hope are, one is an armed counter-protester that I met in Dallas, Texas, when I was 19 years old, or 18 years old. We were doing town halls around the country, and as you can imagine, in Dallas, Texas, we were especially popular. And there was a group of armed counter-protesters outside of our event screaming that we were coming to take their guns. One of them had a sign that said, "David Hogg is a crisis actor." And I went out and did what any sane person would do and talk to them. And I did it in part because I was like, well, I'm the person that has the privilege enough to be able to talk to them here, that probably I'm trying to put myself in harm's way so that my other classmates don't have to. And I went out and talked to them and I said, "Why are you here right now?" And they're here, and they're like, "Well, we're here because you're trying to take our guns, you know?" And I'm like, "Well, are you trying to harm?" And he said, as I'm having this discussion with this man who's like 6'3" and like, 5 times my weight, he has an AR-15 strapped across his chest. And he's like, "Well, because you're here to take my guns." I said, "Well, are you a danger to are you a danger to yourself or somebody else?" He said, "No." And I said, "Well, great, then I'm not trying to take your gun. But let me ask you this. Let's say that a 19-year-old here in Dallas threatens to shoot up your local high school, and he has the gun that you currently are holding. Do you think that 19-year-old should be able to continue to have that gun?" And he's like, "No, of course not." I said, "Well, then you agree with me. Because in Parkland, he could. And we didn't have a red flag law in place, despite the fact that the police were called to his house over a dozen times the year before the shooting. And he repeatedly threatened to shoot up my high school." And he's like, "That's crazy." I said, "I know." And I, of course, he didn't end up agreeing with me on everything. But what he did end up doing is he ended up crying. Because he realized that the people that he was protesting really were just young people that didn't want their friends to be killed anymore. They weren't part of some massive government conspiracy. They were part of an unfortunately all too common story in this country. And then the last person I'll say gives me hope was a guy I met door knocking in Houston, Texas. Last cycle, Leaders We Deserve was supporting a candidate named Molly Cook. She was running against a Democrat in a blue seat who voted to arm teachers and voted to give those teachers $25,000 for being armed. Texas Democrats are a different breed. And they're getting better, though. And I go and knock on what's supposed to be this door of like a 6-year-old woman named Lisa, and it ends up being her 20-year-old son named Kai, who is shirtless and has gaming headphones on when he answers the door. And he goes, "Sup?" And I say, have you heard about this candidate? She supports abortion rights and, stronger gun laws and all this stuff. And he's like, "That's cool." And he says to me, "Is AIPAC funding her campaign? The Israel lobby? And is she taking money from corporations?" And I was like, "Well, this is a state Senate race, not an actual Senate race, so AIPAC has no involvement here." And no, she's not taking money from corporations because Leaders We Deserve endorsed candidates don't take money from corporations. And he's like, "Well, who's funding her campaign then?" And we just gave her a check for $300,000 because there's no contribution limits in Texas. It's crazy. I explained how we work and how we have like all these grassroots donors. And I got to see his face shift from one of suspicion and distrust to one of excitement. And I say, "Well, if you take your gaming headphones off and you wait 30 minutes and you give me your phone number, you'll get a call from the candidate answering any questions you have." So I get his phone number. She calls him. The election comes and goes. I text him the day after the election. And because he didn't even think that he could vote. And I was like, "Well, if you're a registered Democrat, then you can." He's like, "Well, great. I will." Sure. Right. And I texted him the day after the election and say, "Hey, did you get a chance to vote?" And he said, "Yes, I did. Thank you so much." And I said, "Well, thank you, because you were Molly Cook's 62nd vote to become the youngest state senator in Texas since Sam Houston. And she now just led the walkout of the state Senate to break quorum in Texas so that you guys here in California could do what you just did on the redistricting stuff." So that's what gives me hope.
Love it. Awesome.
All right. When you asked what sustains me, I took it really literally. I was thinking a really good cup of coffee and the new Jonas Brothers album that just came out. No, in all seriousness, like it is this. It is being in rooms like this. It's being able to have conversations and partners like the ones we have up on the stage, the ones that are out in this audience that are taking on this work and this issue every single day. You've heard how this is personal for all of us, and unfortunately, that is not unique. This is an issue that is uniquely American. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. My mom came here from India in 1970. She met my dad, who is a black man from Wilmington, Delaware, and she never thought guns was going to be something that was going to be the thing that kept her up late at night. She joined Moms Demand Action and started working on this issue when I started working for Everytown. But like seeing people take their personal time, which is so precious to us, and just dedicating it to this movement is what gives me hope. And it's what sustains me, and it's why I keep going, is like knowing that this is solvable and that we are inching closer and closer and closer to the America we all want to see.
Love it. Okay, well, we are at time, so as I close us out, I want to say this is such a critical moment in the ongoing effort to make our communities safer from gun violence, and it's a moment that requires courage and conviction and fortitude and resolve and community building and advocacy and compassion and empathy and care. And you have seen that all on full display during this panel. So let's give our amazing panelists a round of applause. And I also want to say to all of you, there's a lot of places you could have been tonight. You have families and professions and communities that need you and want your presence, and of all the places you decided to be here. And so I want to say thank you for that. Our democracy and our progress and our forward movement is based on engagement and participation, and you are engaged and you are participating. You are part of this ongoing fight. So tonight is also a reminder that we are not powerless and we are not alone, and that we are all in this fight together. Thanks for coming out.